Imagine a world where your mother, your grandmother, a woman you might have known, a widow, was systematically stripped of her dignity, her livelihood, and her very future. Not by a natural disaster, not by famine alone, but by the calculated policies of a foreign power. This is not a tale of some distant, ancient injustice. This is the stark reality of India in 1870, and the hidden wound inflicted by British rule. The devastating poverty of Indian widows, a poverty not just of circumstance, but of deliberate, caste-inflicted design. We often think of British India as a period of progress, of railways, of law and order. But behind that veneer of imperial ambition lay a brutal economic machinery, a machine that ruthlessly exploited existing social structures for its own gain. And nowhere was this exploitation more keenly felt, more cruelly amplified, than in the lives of India's millions of widows. Let's be clear from the outset. The British did not invent the caste system. India's complex social hierarchy predates their arrival by centuries. But the British, in their pursuit of power and profit, became expert manipulators of this system. They understood its fault lines, its inherent inequalities, and they used them to their advantage, often solidifying and exacerbating them to maintain control and extract wealth. Consider the year 1870. India was deep into its colonial era. The East India Company's reign had ended in blood and fire with the Mutiny of 1857, and direct British Crown rule had commenced. Yet the economic policies remained largely the same, and in many ways intensified. The colonial administration was primarily concerned with generating revenue for Britain, not with the welfare of the Indian populace. And who bore the brunt of this neglect, this calculated impoverishment? Indian widows. In traditional Indian society, the status of a widow was often precarious. Societal norms dictated remarriage was often discouraged, particularly for higher castes. This left many women dependent on their deceased husband's family or on their sons. But what happened when a widow had no sons, or when the patriarchal family circle closed ranks, or worse, when the very economic structure of the society was deliberately undermined? This is where British policy becomes a direct, contributing factor to their destitution. The British revenue system, the infamous land revenue settlements, was designed to extract as much surplus as possible from Indian agriculture. Zamindars, the traditional landholders, were made liable for enormous tax payments. To meet these demands, they were incentivized to maximize cultivation, often at the expense of smaller landholders and marginalized communities. This created a ripple effect of economic instability, pushing many into debt and landlessness. Now think about the widow. If her husband was a small landholder and he died, leaving her with no male heir or insufficient resources, she was instantly vulnerable. The British revenue system often made it impossible for her to maintain the land, to pay the exorbitant taxes. The land would be auctioned off, and she would be left with nothing. But it wasn't just land. The deindustrialization of India under British rule played a crucial role. Traditional Indian industries, textiles, handicrafts, were systematically dismantled to make way for British manufactured goods. This destroyed the livelihoods of countless artisans and weavers. Imagine a weaver, a skilled craftsman whose family depended on his trade. If he died and his wife was left to fend for herself, where could she turn? The traditional avenues of employment for women, often tied to household production and local markets, were shrinking, if not disappearing entirely. The British, in their quest for cheap raw materials and captive markets, actively suppressed Indian industries. The historian Ramila Thapar, in her extensive work on Indian history, points to how British policies actively favored British industries, leading to the decline of indigenous manufacturing. This wasn't an accidental consequence. It was a deliberate strategy. So in 1870, we have a widow. She might have been a woman of means before her husband's death. She might have had a secure place within her family and community. But now, the economic foundation of her life was being eroded. The British tax policies made land ownership a precarious gamble. The destruction of local industries removed vital avenues of employment. And what about the so-called charitable initiatives of the British? Often, these were more about maintaining social control and projecting an image of benevolence than genuine relief. Orphanages and almshouses, while providing some basic sustenance, were often overcrowded, underfunded, and failed to address the systemic issues that created the poverty in the first place. They became a way to manage the visible signs of destitution, not to eradicate its root causes. The British administrators were not ignorant of these realities. Their own reports, their own surveys, documented the growing poverty. Yet their policies rarely shifted to alleviate it. Instead, they often reinforced existing social hierarchies. If a widow was from a lower caste, her situation was compounded. The social stigma attached to lower castes, combined with economic dispossession, meant a near-impossible struggle for survival. Consider the writings of Dadabhai Naoroji, the Grand Old Man of India. In his seminal work, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, published later, but reflecting the realities of the period, he meticulously detailed the drain of wealth from India to Britain. This drain wasn't just about money flowing out. It was about the systematic extraction of resources that could have been invested in India's own development, in creating opportunities, in supporting vulnerable populations. The British viewed India as a source of raw materials and a market for their goods. Their economic policies were geared towards facilitating this. This meant prioritizing the export of raw cotton, indigo, and other commodities to feed British factories, rather than supporting Indian textile production. It meant imposing tariffs that favored British goods, making it difficult for Indian businesses to compete. So when we talk about caste-inflicted poverty in 1870, we must understand that the British acted as a powerful accelerant. They didn't create the caste system, but they weaponized it. They exploited the vulnerabilities inherent in a hierarchical society to further their own economic agenda. Let's look at a specific example, though finding individual widows in historical records from 1870 is challenging. The evidence is often in the aggregate, in the reports of famines, in the surveys of poverty. The Great Famine of 1876-78, while slightly later, was a direct consequence of the economic policies that were firmly in place by 1870. During such famines, who suffered the most? The landless, the marginalized, and yes, widows without male support. Their inability to access food or resources was directly linked to their economic precarity, a precarity amplified by British policies. The British administration established relief works during famines, but these were often meager wages for backbreaking labor, barely enough to survive, and often inaccessible to the weakest and most infirm. A frail widow, struggling to find food, would find it nearly impossible to participate in these grueling tasks. The economic structure that the British built in India was not designed for equitable development. It was designed for extraction. The land revenue demands were often so high that they left farmers with little surplus. This meant that when a male head of household died, there was often no buffer, no savings, no assets to fall back on. The widow was immediately plunged into crisis. Furthermore, the British legal system, while ostensibly impartial, often reinforced patriarchal structures. Property laws, inheritance laws, were interpreted in ways that often disfavored women, especially widows, in the absence of male representation. While some reforms were introduced later, in 1870, the legal landscape was often a minefield for women seeking to secure their economic rights. The narrative we are often told is one of benevolent administration, of bringing order to chaos. But the reality for millions of Indian women, particularly widows, was one of systematic disempowerment and impoverishment. The British colonial enterprise, by its very design, created an economic system that was inherently extractive and unequal. They fostered an environment where traditional avenues of support for women, even within the flawed caste system, were undermined. The destruction of local economies meant fewer opportunities for women to earn independently. The revenue demands on land made it difficult for families to retain their assets, leaving widows even more vulnerable. Think about the psychological toll. Not just the hunger, the cold, the illness, but the loss of dignity, the feeling of abandonment. To be a widow in 1870, facing the crushing weight of poverty, was to be invisible, to be forgotten by the very system that claimed to govern. The British justified their rule by claiming to bring progress and civilization. But progress for whom? Civilization for whom? The evidence points to a starkly different reality for the most vulnerable women in Indian society. Their poverty was not a natural disaster. It was a consequence of deliberate economic policies that were blind to their plight and in many ways actively contributed to their suffering. When we look at the historical documents, the economic data, the contemporary accounts from Indian thinkers and activists, a clear picture emerges. The British Empire, in its pursuit of wealth and power, inadvertently and often deliberately exacerbated existing social inequalities. And the Indian widow, a figure already in a precarious social position, found herself at the epicenter of this engineered poverty. This was not just about passive neglect. It was about active policy choices that prioritized British economic interests over the basic human needs of the Indian population. It was about a colonial administration that, while aware of the growing destitution, failed to implement measures that would genuinely uplift the poor, particularly women without male protectors. So in 1870, as the sun set on another day in British India, for countless widows, it wasn't just the end of a day. It was the relentless continuation of a struggle made infinitely harder by the economic architecture of empire, an architecture that, by design or by devastating neglect, plunged them into a caste-inflicted poverty. The wounds of this era run deep. They remind us that economic policies have human faces, and that the pursuit of empire can leave behind a legacy of profound and enduring hardship. The question we must ask ourselves today is, how do we acknowledge these forgotten stories, these silenced voices, and ensure that such injustices are never repeated?